So we turn now to Coventry. The directors of the Haemophilia Centre at Coventry in the 70s and 80s included Dr. later Professor Shinton and Dr. Maurice Strevens. The latter's provided a written statement to the inquiry. I shall go to it at various stages of the presentation, but for your notes, sir, it's WITN 38080005. Dr. Strevens and Professor Shinton were co-directors at Coventry from 1979 to 1991, and then when Professor Shinton retired, Dr. Strevens became the sole director of the centre until 2005. The centre was initially based in the haematology department at the Coventry and Warwickshire Hospital. That closed eventually, I think in 2006, and was replaced by University Hospital, Coventry. The Coventry Hospital was part of the West Midlands Regional Health Authority, and there were a number of other haemophilia centres in the region, part of the same regional organisation. Birmingham Queen Elizabeth's Hospital, Birmingham Children's, both of which we've examined in previous hearings, and then Hereford, Shrewsbury, Stoke-on-Trent, Worcester and Wolverhampton, which we'll be looking at this afternoon. The West Midlands regional centres were supplied in terms of blood supplies and factor VIII products from BPL by the Regional Transfusion Centre in Birmingham. And Dr. Strevens, in his witness statement, explains a recollection of working in close collaboration with the Birmingham centres, and then with the Regional Transfusion Centre in Birmingham supplying the blood supplies to the whole of the West Midlands region. There was a working party, a West Midlands working party, called the Working Party on the Treatment of Haemophiliacs, which met regularly throughout the 1970s, 1980s and early 1990s. You may recall, so we looked at a series of their meetings in the Birmingham presentation in earlier hearings. I'll refer only to 2 or 3 documents this afternoon, but I can say that Dr. Shinton was a very faithful attender at those meetings throughout the 1970s, 80s and into the early 90s, and that Dr. Strevens also attended those meetings throughout the 80s and into the early 1990s. If we go to one meeting from the 1970s at SHIN 5046, these are the minutes of a meeting of the Working Party, May 1974. We can see a range of attendees, and there'll be some of the names from centres that we look at in the course of the afternoon, but they include Dr. Shinton from Coventry. And then if we look at the second paragraph under the heading Designation of Centres, it says this: Dr. Stewart referred to the fact that a meeting had been held at the offices of the then Regional Hospital Board some years ago, at which it had been agreed that 5 satellite centres should be established at Stoke-on-Trent, Coventry, Worcester, Shrewsbury and Wolverhampton for the treatment of haemophiliacs with cryoprecipitate. So you will see there, sir, the origins of the various centres in the West Midlands region. If we go to page 3, bottom half of the page, we can then see that the summary. Sir Edward summed up the views of those present. 1, that the 5 existing satellite centres should remain in being, and that Hereford should be recognised as a 6th centre for the treatment of haemophiliacs. 2, that cryoprecipitate should be retained for use as the main form of treatment for the present. 3, that the eventual distribution and use of freeze-dried factor VIII concentrate should follow the same pattern as the existing system used for cryoprecipitate. 4, that an emergency reserve of freeze-dried factor VIII be kept at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham. And 5, that the Working Party currently assembled should meet at regular intervals of 6 or 12 months. At such meetings, the designated consultant should supply details of the number of patients treated and of the facilities available and the type of treatment. And those meetings do indeed take place on a quite often 6-monthly basis. in the years that follow. Dr. Shinton was appointed chair of this working party in December 1978. And if we look at, then moving forward to the minutes of a meeting of the working party in December 1982, SHIN 5031, we see there, this is a meeting 6th of December 82, Dr. Shinton is now the chair. If we go over to the bottom of the second page, we can see at this point in time, under the heading Supplies of Cryoprecipitate and Freeze-Dried Factor VIII, Dr. Aller, who was a representative of the Regional Transfusion Centre, reported that at present there was an excess supply of cryoprecipitate, possibly due to overstocking in anticipation of a reduced supply of factor VIII concentrate from BPL. He understood that the BPL would be resuming normal production soon and the situation should revert to normal. The shortfall in supply of factor VIII from the BPL had been made up by greater purchases of commercial factor VIII, and the stock had not been taken up by increased, and I think that probably should be slack, it says slock, had not been taken up by increased use of cryoprecipitate. There were some doubts about the methods of funding for the purchase of commercial factor VIII. Dr. Stewart agreed to clarify the position. That's an example of the kind of discussions that would take place on a regular basis throughout the 70s and 80s at these meetings, when issues about supply, shortfall, use of cryoprecipitate concentrate from BPL and commercial concentrates all fell for discussion from time to time. Coventry was also part of the Oxford Haemophilia supra-region, and there were occasional meetings in the 1970s of the Haemophilia Centre Directors and Blood Transfusion Centre Directors within the Oxford Haemophilia supra-region. Dr. Shinton, for example, attending a meeting in July 1976 and June 1978 of that particular group. Turn then to consider the numbers of patients regularly treated at Coventry. Dr. Streven's recollection in his statement was that direct ongoing care was provided for around 30 patients on home treatment. His recollection is not far off. The annual returns for the period 76 through to 85 show a range of between 20 and 33 haemophilia A patients being treated, up to 5 patients with Hemophilia B, and up to 8 patients with von Willebrand's. If we look at the annual returns, starting in 1976, at HCDO 301071, we can see annual return for 1976. The director here is identified as Dr. Shinton and indeed Dr. Cotter as well, who then I think left Coventry towards the end of the 1970s. Total number of haemophilic patients treated during the year 33, Christmas disease patients 3. And then you will see that by a very substantial margin indeed, the main form of treatment in 1976 was cryoprecipitate, over 500,000 units of cryoprecipitate used. No NHS concentrate used at all. 3 different commercial concentrates in use, factor VIII, hemophil, and cryobulin, which combined add up to 157,685 units of commercial concentrate. So significant volume, but far more in terms of cryoprecipitate usage. If we turn to 1977, HCDO 301152, and we go to page 4. Again, we can see the numbers of patients treated, 29 haemophilia, 2 with antibodies, 4 Hemophilia B patients. Again, we can see cryoprecipitate in significant use, although the volume has decreased from the preceding year. so just under 325,000 units. We can see also that NHS concentrate is now being used apparently for the first time to a significant extent, just under 192,000 units. But that commercial concentrate, factor 8, is the product in greatest use, 340,407 units, and then some 26,000 odd units of haemophil. So for that year, in contrast to the previous year, it's more concentrate than cryoprecipitate, and indeed more commercial concentrate than cryoprecipitate. The picture in 1978 is at HCDO 301249, page 4. And we see a rather different picture in 1978. Tiny amount of cryoprecipitate used, 560 units. No commercial concentrate used at all in that year, and thus the main product being used, NHS concentrates, 438,799 units. So a very different picture indeed from the previous year. If we then go to 1979, HCDO 0001317, we can see no cryoprecipitate used at all, and the main product in use is NHS concentrate, but commercial concentrates have made a reappearance and are being used to a significant extent, a range of them now, factor 8, haemophil and cryobuline, with the latter being the largest in terms of volume. And it's roughly 188,000 units of commercial concentrate as against 414,000 or so units of NHS concentrate. The picture in relation to treatment of the Christmas disease patients remains the use of NHS factor 9 concentrate at this centre. When we come to the beginning of the 1980s, the return for 1980 is HCDO 301414. Again, we can see no cryoprecipitate in use for the treatment of haemophilia A patients, although it is used for the treatment of von Willebrand's. And then, again, we have a mix of NHS concentrates and commercial concentrates being used. A little more NHS concentrate than commercial concentrate, but the difference is not vast. And the commercial concentrate in use is predominantly the Armour product factor 8, with a small amount of cryobuline. And we'll see from this that home treatment clearly is well established in Coventry from the numbers involved. 1981 then, HCDO 301512. So it's a very small amount of cryoprecipitate for use in the treatment of haemophilia A. Again, cryoprecipitate is used for von Willebrand's as well in that year for the treatment of a carrier of haemophilia A. The picture there is of NHS concentrate as the main treatment used. That's, I think, 463,000 units odd. And then we have one commercial concentrate in use that year. Again, it's the Armour product, factor 8, roughly 141,000 units in use. 1982 is at HCDO 0001614. We can see cryoprecipitate used there simply for the treatment of von Willebrand's. Small amount of commercial concentrate being used for von Willebrand's as well as NHS concentrate. And then, again, treatment really shared between NHS concentrates and Armour concentrates, but now the Armour product predominates. So roughly 522,000 as against to something in the order of 424,000 units of NHS concentrate. the balance shifts again the other way in 1983, HCDO 301711, leaving aside a very small amount of cryoprecipitate used for haemophilia A and for the treatment of von Willebrand's disease patients. We can see again it's NHS concentrates and the ARMA product factor 8. But now the main product in use in this year is the NHS concentrate, 557,000 or thereabouts, contrasting with around 122, 123,000 units of the ARMA product. And then lastly, 1984, HCDO 301806. The usage of cryoprecipitate has crept up slightly, although it's still a very small proportion of the overall therapeutic material used. And again, it's NHS concentrate and factor 8, but now with the NHS concentrate far exceeding the volume of commercial concentrate used, albeit there is still some 75,000 odd, 73,000 odd units used. And then we can see the FIBA at the bottom, and also DDAVP appearing for the use of patients with von Willebrand's. Come back to what Dr. Streven says about product usage and treatment policies shortly, but there's no contemporaneous material other than the returns themselves to demonstrate in any specific treatment policy at Coventry. If we then turn to Dr. Streven's statement, WITN 3808005, and if we pick it up at the bottom of page 10, please. He says this in paragraph 10.1, the general principles of treatment were that all blood products should be avoided if possible. DDAVP or cryoprecipitate should be used in preference to factor concentrate if practical and safe. And so again, the extent to which that's borne out by the annual returns will be a matter you may wish to consider. This would only be practical for patients with mild disease, and especially if they'd never been exposed to factor concentrates. UK concentrate should be used in preference to American products, although this had to be tempered by the severely limited amount of UK concentrate relative to demand. Finally, attempts would be made to limit the number of different suppliers of American products subject to availability. And in relation to that latter point, it is fair to observe that it is a single commercial product in the latter years of the period we looked at that predominates the ARMA product. And then he says in paragraph 10.2, as far as I can remember, all products were supplied from Birmingham, I think the transfusion centre. I think the Birmingham Centre directors devised the purchasing policy, and I'm confident they would have been based on the principles outlined above. In practice, this meant that children were supplied with BPL products and adults received American products. Pausing there, we don't, I think, have the data to determine the extent to which that was applied in practice in relation to Coventry, but we know, of course, in relation to Birmingham Children's Hospital, that was not the policy adopted because of the very substantial use of commercial concentrates for children at that facility. In terms of the switch to heat treatment, Dr. Streven deals with that towards the bottom of this page, paragraph 11.2. He says, following the development of tests for HIV, the degree of contamination of concentrates became apparent, and so we switched to heat-treated products as quickly as possible. If we then turn on, in his statement, please, bottom of the next page, where he talks about cryoprecipitate, he says, in the 1970s, this is paragraph 15.1, prior to factor 8 concentrates, cryoprecipitate was the treatment of choice for bleeding episodes. And then he explains the process with the melting of the bags and the infusion of the cryoprecipitate and the length of time that would take. We go to the next page, picking it up 4 lines down. He says the big advantage of freeze-dried concentrates was that the product could be at home by patient or parent, which led to treatment being given far more quickly. As a result, it quickly became apparent that target joints were much less common, patients were not getting arthritis, and were able to live a much more normal life. And he says in the last sentence of that paragraph, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the introduction of factor concentrates on the lives of patients with severe haemophilia. The next paragraph, 15.2, he says this, I am aware that some patients in some centres used cryoprecipitate at home, and obviously we've seen examples of that. He adds, I do not think this was a practical consideration for most patients. And then if we turn on to paragraph 17.1 over the page, he says, as stated previously, home treatment with concentrates was firmly established when I started working in Coventry, and this naturally evolved into prophylaxis. Cryoprecipitate was never considered as an alternative to concentrates in the context of home treatment. Cryoprecipitate was always considered the treatment of choice for patients with mild/moderate disease who required infrequent treatment of limited duration and non-life-threatening severity. Whenever possible, these treatment decisions would involve a consultant haematologist day or night. This was regarded as particularly important for patients who had never previously received concentrate. He also recalls the policy of home treatment having been firmly established when he arrived, and the understanding within the centre being that all patients should be offered home treatment as quickly as possible. If we then go to the bottom of the next page, paragraph 20.1, he says, as a general policy factor, concentrates would always be avoided in children with mild or moderate disease. And to reinforce this, no factor concentrate was issued from the blood bank without the involvement of a haematologist. So it'll be a matter for you to consider in due course. But Dr. Streven's account of the use of home treatment for families, in particular children, would make, I think, fairly clear that at least children with severe haemophilia were routinely treated with factor concentrates at Coventry. And again, that would be borne out by the picture that emerges from the annual returns. In terms of what information was given about risks, Dr. Streven says at page 23, please show me. There, he says this in paragraph 38.1. The number of new patients commencing factor concentrates in Coventry between 1979, and the relevance of that being that's the date when he joined the centre in Coventry, and the suspicion/identification of the AIDS virus in concentrates would have been small. Advice given would have been on an individual basis. They would have been warned about hepatitis B, and they would have been offered vaccination prior to commencing therapy. Giving advice about HCV or HIV would have been difficult from around 1983 to 1985-6, when there were emerging suspicions of AIDS being transmitted via blood products, and non-A, non-B not being the benign infection it was once thought to be. Fortunately, as far as I can remember, we did not have to deal with this situation because of an absence of new patients. Now, it may be correct as a matter of fact that there were few new patients in the period he's describing, but of course that may beg the question of whether information should have been given to existing patients, the provision of information about risks not necessarily being limited to something that's done on a one-off basis only when a patient commences therapy for the very first time, particularly as new and emerging risks come to light. We've made reference in the written presentation notes to a number of the accounts that you've received from individuals treated at Coventry or whose family members were treated at Coventry, which provide an account of not being given advice, information or warnings about the risks of blood products, either in relation to risks of hepatitis or in relation to risks of HIV. Dr. Shinton and or Dr. Strevens were regular attenders at UKHCDO meetings. Dr. Shinton in the 70s and 80s, Dr. Strevens in the late 70s and 1980s. They also regularly attended the meetings of the West Midlands Working Party that we looked at earlier. Dr. Shinton attended the meeting at London Heathrow Airport in January 1983. And so that may provide some understanding or context of what they knew or ought to have known in relation to hepatitis and HIV. If we put Dr. Strevens' statement back on screen, please, Shomik, WITN 3808005, and go to page 16. Dr. Strevens sets out in paragraph 22.1 in the bottom half of the page his understanding about hepatitis risks. He says this: when I started in Coventry in 1979, hepatitis B was a clearly defined viral infection and donors and donations were screened for infection. Nevertheless, hepatitis B infection could still infect blood recipients, and so all haemophiliacs were routinely immunised as soon as vaccines became available, and preferably before they started regular treatment. My understanding of non-A, non-B hepatitis was that it was ill-defined and could be due to a number of different viruses or something else completely. It was generally regarded as less severe than Hep B, but without a test for the viruses, little could be said about the nature of the infection. With regards to patients receiving concentrates, it was recognised that soon after commencing treatment, patients experienced what was often a mild illness with minor disturbance of liver function, which sometimes settled but could also result in a persistent mild disturbance of liver function. Whether this was due to persistent infection or something else to do with treatment was not clear. Most doctors did not regard it as a serious problem. However, Dr. Eric Preston, later professor in Sheffield where I trained, became increasingly concerned and eventually took liver biopsies from some affected patients. I remember the results being presented at a UKHCDO meeting. The results showed that some had serious advanced liver disease. HIV infection was the major concern at the time, and effective heat-treated concentrate was subsequently introduced. When non-A, non-B hepatitis was identified as being due to hepatitis C, it was also found that the heat treatment for HIV also inactivated the hepatitis C virus. The reference to training at Sheffield reflects the fact that Dr. Strevens was a senior registrar in haematology in the Sheffield hospitals, comprising both the adult and children's hospital and I think sometime at the blood transfusion centre between November 1975 and November 1979. So he was in Sheffield before he came to Coventry.
Yes, it's probably the result of memory working back, but the dating in paragraph 22.1 is plainly wrong.
Yes.
Because at the time that Professor Preston was reporting was some time before anyone knew of the risk of AIDS being transmitted by blood products.
Yes, Professor Preston, we know, published a particularly significant study in 1978. Which would have been at the time Dr. Strevens was based at Sheffield. But it's only fair to point out that Dr. Strevens would not have been provided with all of these materials that the inquiries looked at.
I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying it's one of the problems of people working back from memory, and that I won't treat this particular chronology as being accurate.
Yes, and also the reference to hepatitis B vaccination. Again, that's something that happened rather later.
Yes, it is.
Not in the 1970s. In relation to AIDS and HIV, as indicated, that Dr. Shinton and also Dr. Strevens were regular attendees at these various meetings. Dr. Shinton in particular at that January 1983 meeting. If we go back in Dr. Strevens' statement to page 13, At paragraph 15.3, he talks about the risk of infection from concentrates being an emerging issue. And then in 15, and then he refers to the UK HCDO letter from June 83. And then in 15.4 says, in much of the practice of interventional medicine, there's always a balance between risk and benefit. And then he says in the last sentence of that paragraph, in 1983, there was very little data available about the size of the risks from concentrates, confounded by the absence of tests to predict problems, and so treatment was provided in this context. And then if we go on to the next page, no, sorry, top of page 15, my apologies, paragraph 18.3. He says there was emerging evidence of a link between HIV infection and the use of factor concentrates throughout the early 80s. How this would translate into policy was always going to be difficult. Fortunately, we had within the UK HCDO national/international experts who met to discuss these issues and offer guidance to haemophilia directors like myself. And then the document he refers to is the June 1983 letter. He says that's a good example of the guidance we were being given. We were, of course, all free to take or reject the advice. It is always important to address the consequences of extreme actions like stopping all concentrate usage. As an older haematologist, I have vivid recollections of the consequences of inadequately treated haemophilia, something that's too easy to forget. As far as I can remember, there was no significant change to home treatment policy, and that's in response to the risk of AIDS. And then if we move to page 20, no, sorry, can we start with page 18? He goes back into the question of developing knowledge of risk in relation to HTLV3 AIDS. In 26.1, he refers to cases of unusual immunodeficiency being first described in the USA in the early 1980s. And then in the last sentence of that paragraph, there were early concerns that it could represent a blood-borne infection, and this suspicion was enforced when similar problems started to be seen in patients with haemophilia who were using recently introduced factor concentrates. There was always concern in the UK about the use of American concentrates. The concern was of a non-specific nature, that is, blood should be taken from healthy, unpaid volunteers rather than paid donors, some from dubious backgrounds and in poor health. The first potential case of immunodeficiency in a UK haemophilia patient was featured in a letter from the UK HCDO in 1983 to all haemophilia centre directors and included advice about the use of concentrates. And again, that's the advice letter that we've looked at on numerous occasions. And then he says in 26.3, from memory, I thought the advice was balanced, the issue being the dramatic effect on haemophilia care if all concentrates were withdrawn at that stage. And then finally, on this issue, if we go to page 20, he says in paragraph 30.1, the UK HCDO letter from 1983 alerted us to the issue, and in accordance with the advice given, patients continued to receive concentrates. It was in 1985 that the extent of the problem became clear. So it would appear from that the June 1983 letter with its recommendations, or however they might be termed, did not lead to any change of direction or change of policy on the part of the Coventry Haemophilia Centre. If we then pick up the picture in terms of Coventry and the West Midlands in late 1984, SHIN 5026_002 this is a meeting of the West Midlands Working Party, not one of its regular meetings. These are minutes of the extraordinary meeting held on the 17th of December, and we know from the context it's 1984, in the library of the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre, Birmingham, to discuss the implication of AIDS on the provision of concentrate for the treatment of haemophiliacs. And we can see that the meeting is chaired by now Professor Shinton. And then if we look underneath the list of apologies, the purpose of the meeting, a meeting was held to discuss the implication of the use of factor VIII concentrate in the light of the death of 2 haemophiliacs from AIDS. And then there's a report from Professor Hill, which I think we looked at during the Birmingham presentation. And then if we go further down the page, to the bottom half of the page, the committee accepted that the use of factor VIII concentrate was associated with a risk of transfusing the AIDS virus. And pausing there, no doubt, so one of the issues you may wish to consider in due course is whether these kind of discussions and realisations were taking place timelessly, or whether they could or should have been matters that could and should have been considered more comprehensively at an earlier date than December 1984. There's then Dr. Stewart, Dr. Hill inform the committee of various matters, and then we can see the sentence beginning, unfortunately the chairman, so that's Professor Shinton, informed the committee that that's the availability of heat-treated factor concentrates, was unlikely to occur with NHS factor VIII until the 1st of April 1985, but that Armour heat-treated material would be available in January 1985. Following discussion, a treatment policy to cover the interim period was agreed upon. So this was intended to be a West Midlands-wide treatment policy with effect from January 85, and therefore including, but not limited to, the Coventry Centre. 1, mildly affected patients, haemophilia A and von Willebrand's, to be treated with DDAVP or cryo. 2, newly diagnosed severe haemophiliacs to be managed wholly on cryoprecipitate. 3, A, patients with no previous exposure to commercial factor VIII should continue on NHS factor VIII. And then top of the next page. B, patients with previous exposure to commercial factor VIII should continue on NHS factor VIII if available, and heat-treated commercial factor VIII when not. It was stressed that full discussion should take place with the recipients regarding use of therapeutic material, as the availability and speed of HDLB3 screening precluded its use for treatment guidance. So that's the policy with effect from the beginning of 1985. There was a second extraordinary meeting of the working group in February 1985 at SHIN 5025. We can see it again, it's chaired by Professor Shinton, 15th of February 1985. We just look at the bottom half of the page under the heading Supply of Factor VIII. We can see Dr. Ala from the Regional Transfusion Centre reporting to the committee that following a meeting with the Regional Supplies Officer, a supply of heat-treated factor VIII had been negotiated with Armour Pharmaceuticals, and then looking forward to what was anticipated to be NHS heat-treated project available on a named patient basis. And then if we go over the page, there's a modification of the policy. So under the heading 5, AIDS, Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation, it says the document outlining the views of the reference centre directors on the effects of AIDS on the treatment of haemophiliacs was received. It was given full support. Pausing there, so that's no doubt a reference to the AIDS guidance document that was circulated by Professor Bloom following the 10th of December 1984 meeting of Reference Centre Directors, Department of Health and others, which took place at Elstree, which again we've looked at on a number of occasions. So the minutes continue. The treatment policy as advocated in the minutes of the extraordinary meeting of the 17th of December, so the West Midlands policy, was at variance with that from the Reference Centre Directors. It was agreed that NHS untreated material should no longer be used. The new treatment strategy now recommended is DDAVP in mild haemophilia A and von Willebrand's if possible. For haemophilia A needing blood products, 1, virgin patients, those not previously exposed to concentrate, and children use cryo or heated NHS factor VIII if possible. 2, severe and moderate haemophiliacs previously treated with factor VIII use heat-treated NHS factor VIII if available, or heat-treated US commercial. And then for haemophilia B, mild Christmas, fresh frozen plasma if possible, otherwise NHS factor IX. 2, virgin patients and those not previously exposed to concentrate use fresh frozen plasma or NHS factor IX concentrate if essential. And then 3, severe and moderate Christmas disease previously exposed to factor IX concentrate continue to use NHS factor 9. So that's a further policy development for the West Midlands area in February 1985. And then there's a third meeting in July 1985 at SHIN 5023. If we go to the second page, so I should say, again, it's chaired by Professor Shinton. There's a further review of the guidelines, picking it up in the second paragraph, in view of the shortfall of supplies, and that Professor Bloom, in a letter to the BMJ, proposed a policy whereby cryoprecipitate should not be used until HTLV3 screening of donors was established. The committee agreed to review the treatment guidelines. And you'll see we now have, for example, no reference to cryoprecipitate. So it's DDAVP in mild haemophilia and von Willebrand's disease if possible. And then we have reference to use of the NHS product 8Y in the categories of patients set out. And then if we go further down, just so that we can pick it up for haemophilia B at D, as heat-treated factor 9(9)A is not available until October 85, no change in policy is envisaged. So that's a further amendment to the treatment policy in 1985. We then see bottom half of the page, a regional haemophilia policy in relation to those found to have antibodies to HTLV3. So covering Coventry, but not limited to Coventry. It was agreed that haemophiliacs with HTLV3 antibodies or AIDS-related disorders should be followed up at the discretion of the haemophilia centre directors. All haemophiliacs should be screened. Spouses and immediate families should be offered screening for HTLV3 antibody. Any haemophiliacs opting out of knowing his status should be advised to behave as though he were HTLV3 positive. It was considered appropriate to inform the GP, but not the clinical medical officer in the case of children. Dr. Hill informed the committee that minor difficulties regarding schooling had been encountered, and it was agreed that the chairman, so that's Professor Shinton, should approach the clinical medical officers to discuss the problems related to the management of haemophiliacs at school in relation to viruses and bleeding. In view of the caution relating to blood donors, Dr. Arler asked that spouses of haemophiliacs be asked to desist from donating blood and their addresses be sent to him so that the donor panel could be modified. It was thought appropriate to review the HTLV3 status in haemophiliacs and spouses every 12 months. And then the committee were unanimous in the opinion that haemophiliacs and spouses, when HTLV3 positivity had been identified, should be advised against pregnancy. And we've seen how that affected some individuals in some of the powerful evidence that you've heard. So those are the Coventry and indeed wider West Midlands discussions in relation to treatment in the end of 84 and the first half of 1985. In terms of the process for testing patients for HTLV3 and informing them of their diagnosis, Dr. Strevens was unable to assist. He explained in his statement that Professor Shinton, together with the haemophilia sister, organised the testing of patients for HIV and indeed later for HCV, and that they would have been responsible, they being the Professor Shinton and haemophilia sister, for counselling patients. And so he was not aware of what the process had been for pre or post-test counselling. Again, you've had evidence, sir, from a number of witnesses or received written evidence from a number of witnesses regarding the position at Coventry. We've summarised some of it in our written note. I'll just refer to a couple of examples of the evidence. You have evidence, for example, from a patient who says that his parents were not informed by Professor Shinton of a January 1985 HTLV3 result until some 8 months later. That's one example of the evidence you've received. Another example is from a witness describing how her husband was tested and informed of his diagnosis. And she described in a witness statement Dr. Shinton inviting them into the office for a chat, casually saying your test results are positive, the couple then asking what test results, and Dr. Shinton saying the patient had been diagnosed with HIV. The record showed, the witness explained in her statement, that the positive test had been undertaken in November 1984, and there was therefore a period of some months before the couple were told the results of the test. So those are two examples of the evidence that you've received. There are others. In terms of the numbers of patients at Coventry reported to have seroconverted, if we have INQY 40250, please. Page 2. It's Centre 21. There's a spelling mistake there. It says Coventry. If we go along, we can see there it records 5 patients 1984, 10 patients 1985, and 1 in 1986, giving a total number of HIV cases associated with the centre to 1988 of 16. There is a report at a later working party meeting, West Midlands Working Party meeting from April 1987. I'll just give you the reference, but I won't turn to the document. It's SHIN 5015_001, which records Professor Shinton informing the meeting of a late seroconversion at Coventry considered to be related to the use of heat-treated armour. In relation to hepatitis C, we don't have the figures of the numbers of patients who were infected. Dr. Strevens did not know how many were infected. In terms of then the treatment arrangements at Coventry for patients diagnosed with HIV and or with hepatitis C, Dr. Strevens explains that he took over the Hemophilia clinic when Professor Shinton retired in 1991. He recalls at that time patients with HIV were being treated with AZT, and his impression was that it was not very effective and patients were deteriorating. And he describes in his statement how gradually different and improved therapies became available, and explains that in due course a separate clinic for HIV patients in conjunction with a genito-urinary medicine specialist was established. In relation to hepatitis C treatment, Dr. Strevens' account is as follows. Routine review by the Hemophilia sister, and then various forms of interferon, he says, were the only treatments available during the time he was in Coventry. He says that the main risks discussed were of unpleasant side effects and the significant risk of failure. So that's the position in relation to Coventry. With all of the West Midlands centres, a reading of all the minutes of the Working Party from 1974 really through to the 1980s will provide a really clear picture of the kind of discussions that were taking place in relation to supplies and shortfall. And I'm not going to refer to them in any further detail this afternoon, but we have looked at a number of them, as I say, in the course of the Birmingham presentation. Can I then turn to Wolverhampton? The director of the Wolverhampton Centre from 1976 and during the 1980s was Dr. Allen. Wolverhampton was also part of the West Midlands Regional Health Authority, and Dr. Allen was also a frequent attender of the meetings of the Working Party on the treatment of haemophiliacs, some examples of which we've already looked at. The meeting of the Working Party for the West Midlands region, May 1976, recorded that Wolverhampton had been officially designated as an associate haemophilia centre. As with Coventry, Wolverhampton was supplied by the Regional Transfusion Centre in Birmingham with its blood products. and it too was part of the Oxford Haemophilia supra-region, and a meeting in relation to the supra-region was attended by Dr. Allen in July of 1976. Wolverhampton was a smaller centre in terms of numbers than Coventry. The number of patients treated looking at the annual returns from 1976 to 85 were between 5 and 10 haemophilia A patients, up to 3 haemophilia B patients, and 1 to 2 patients with von Willebrand's disease. Our only real guide to product usage comes from the annual returns themselves for this centre. So if we start with 1976, HCDO 5068_002, and we go to page 4, we can see that in 1976, 9 patients with haemophilia treated, 3 patients with Christmas disease, and then we can see that the main product in use was cryoprecipitate, no NHS concentrates used, some factor VIII armour product, and some cryobuline, the immuno product. So roughly 24,500 commercial units, as opposed to 94,000 odd units of cryoprecipitate. The picture shifts by the following year, 1977, HCDO 301220, page 5. Again, no NHS concentrates in use at all. The volume of cryoprecipitate used has decreased fairly significantly, now down to 39,000 odd. And the product in greatest use is the armour product factor VIII, just under 53 and 8,500. If we go to 1979, HCDO 301384, we see a further change, no cryoprecipitate at all in use in Wolverhampton in 1979. The main treatment in use there, NHS concentrates, just over 64,000, with just under 5,000 units of armour factor VIII. The picture throughout in relation to treatment of the patients with Christmas disease is the NHS factor IX provision. If we then move to 1980, HCDO 301483, again we'll see no cryoprecipitate, NHS concentrate in substantial use, but now the product in greatest use is the commercial concentrate, the armour product. So a total roughly of 155,000 plus units of armour combining hospital and home treatment together, as opposed to approximately 92,500 units of NHS concentrates. Again, the extent to which this is the result of shortages, supply issues, or conscious choice on the part of the centre directors is not something we can discern from the returns themselves. 1981, HCDO 301586 continues the pattern of no cryoprecipitate and the treatments in use being NHS concentrate and the armour product. But in this year, there is more NHS concentrate used than commercial concentrate. Roughly 186,000 compared to 127,600. However, if we then turn to 1982, HCDO 301682, whilst we again see no cryoprecipitate for use with haemophilia A patients, it is used for treatment of a von Willebrand's disease patient. the same picture of NHS concentrate and armour product emerges, but now more armour product is used in this year than NHS. And the picture for 1983 is slightly unclear. It's HCDO 301778. We can see it's still NHS concentrate and armour factor 8, and the figures for NHS concentrate are fairly clear: 86,745 hospital, 79,000 home treatment. The figure for the armour product, it's not entirely clear whether that's intended to read 75,000 or possibly 175,000. And then finally, 1984, HCDO 301871. There is some use of cryoprecipitate that year, not a huge amount, 30 bags used for the treatment of haemophilia A patients, as well as von Willebrand's. The NHS figure, in our notes, we'd identified that as, in terms of hospital, 410,533. But looking at it again, and bearing in mind the numbers of patients treated, it may be that that's 40,533. It's not entirely clear. In any event, we can see that the products predominantly used that year is NHS concentrate, albeit if we then follow the arrow down, we can see the armour product also significantly used, both for hospital and home treatment.
It's a huge increase in the amount used. If it's 410, but it does look like 410.
It does look like 410, which is why that's what we put in our notes, but it doesn't seem likely that it would be that much when one looks at the number of patients treated, which remain largely constant. So the previous year, for example, had been 9 haemophilia A patients. This is 10. A year prior to that, 9. So it would seem unlikely, notwithstanding the fact that that is what the writing looks like. If I turn to knowledge of risks of hepatitis HIV, again, nothing by way of direct evidence of Dr. Allen's knowledge of risks of viral infection. He did attend, however, UK HCDO meetings in 1977, 82, 83 and 84, and would presumably have received copies of the minutes of the meetings on a regular basis. Furthermore, if we go to one of the working party, West Midlands Working Party meetings for 1983, SHIN 5030, this is June of 1983, and we can see Dr. Allen in attendance. And if we go to the bottom of the second page, we can see a reference to AIDS, albeit nothing suggesting a very detailed discussion. So it's under the heading Supplies of Cryoprecipitate and Freeze-Dried Factor 8. The second paragraph, Dr. Shinton referred to a letter he'd received from Dr. Ala, who made the point that cryoprecipitate was probably a safer product than Factor 8 concentrate in respect of transmission of AIDS. So that's something expressly flagged up to the attendees of this meeting in 1983. It doesn't, however, appear to have resulted, in, at least insofar as this centre is concerned, with any reversion to cryoprecipitate for the treatment of patients with haemophilia. The only other information in relation to HIV is the data received by UK HCDO. I won't put the table up again on this occasion, but it suggests 3 patients testing positive for HIV in 1985 at this centre. and no information, I'm afraid, available in relation to the extent of hepatitis C. Can I then move to Stoke-on-Trent? So the centre was based at, I think, what was originally the North Staffordshire Hospital, became the Royal Stoke Hospital. And the director from 1976 to 2004 was Dr. Ibbotson. We do have a statement from Dr. Ibbotson. I'll just give the reference for present purposes, WITN 4678001. Again, this centre was part of the West Midlands Regional Health Authority, and Dr. Ibbotson was a member of, and indeed, for part of the time, secretary to, the West Midlands Regional Health Authority Working Party on the Treatment of Haemophilia, whose minutes we've looked at already, and was a regular attendee of meetings of the Working Party from 1976 onwards throughout the 1980s. At the Working Party meeting in May 1976, I don't think we need to go back to it, it's recorded that Stoke is a designated, or had been designated as a haemophilia centre, contrasting with Shrewsbury, Worcester, Hereford and Wolverhampton, which were designated associate centres. Again, it appears that the Regional Transfusion Centre in Birmingham was the supplier of blood and blood products to the Stoke Centre, and that accords with Dr. Ibbotson's recollection in his statement. And again, Stoke was part of the Oxford Haemophilia supra-region, and Dr. Ibbotson attended supra-regional meetings in 1976 and 1978. In terms of the numbers of patients treated from 1976 through to 85, the range was as follows, and it did vary from year to year. The range is between 10 and 21 patients with haemophilia A, up to 4 patients with haemophilia B, and up to 2 patients with von Willebrand's disease. Dr. Ibbotson, in his statement, said he believed that decision-making about the selection and purchase of blood products was a regional decision, which he was not directly involved with. But he says he would try to give the British product to patients if it was available. If we pick the picture up then with the Stoke returns, and the returns quite often refer to it as being the North Staff Centre. 1976 returns HCDO 301121. So we can see there it's described on the form as North Staff's Haemophilia Centre. The director is Dr. Ibbotson. 10 patients with haemophilia, 4 with Christmas disease. And then we can see that the figure for cryoprecipitates, I think, is 54,180. So slightly less than the NHS concentrate in use, which was 60,490. And then small amounts of 3 commercial concentrates, factor 8, Co8 and cryopulin in use. When we come to 1977, HCDO 301207, we see something of a different picture. A slightly larger number of patients treated, 16 haemophilia, 3 Christmas disease. But then in terms of the use of cryoprecipitate, that has significantly increased between 1976 and 1977. The calculation here is done on the basis of a bag having 80 units. We see it elsewhere with 70 units. And the figure then is given as 155,840 units. Whether the calculation of 70 or 80 is used, it's clearly cryoprecipitate, which is the dominant treatment, as compared to NHS concentrates, 14,745 units used. There are then 2 commercial concentrates used to a lesser extent, factor 8 and cryobulin, the figure for NHS factor 9 concentrate has been put in the wrong table, but we can see again it's NHS rather than commercial factor 9 concentrate being used for the treatment of Christmas disease. And that's 1977. We don't have the return for 1978. So we have to pick up the picture in 1979, HCDA 301356. We can see that whilst the volume has declined, cryoprecipitate is still the product in greatest use, 44,000 units, followed by NHS concentrate, 26,645, and then armour, just under 7,500 units. In 1980, the picture's slightly different. HCDO 301453. If we zoom into the figures, they're not terribly clear, but it looks as though 30,000 units of cryoprecipitate, but solely in hospital, so not used for home treatment. And then it looks like 40,500 units of NHS concentrate used in hospital. And then I'm not entirely sure of the next figure. We thought it was probably 56,000 for home treatment. And then we can see armour is the other product used, 34,320 hospital, 14,800 used in, for home treatment. 1981, HCDO 301577.
It's not at all clear, is it?
It's not, no.
It looks, standing back from it, it looks like 18,000. But it's anyone's guess.
It is, really. One could make out a case for a range of different numbers there, unfortunately. If we go then to 1981, HCDO 301577. HCDO 301577. Oh, I've got... Do we go to the next page? Oh, I see what you mean. That's how it comes out. Okay. I have it in a form which is legible. It's like that, which is why it's appearing like that on the screen. And I can tell you what the figures are. The figure for cryoprecipitate solely in hospital is 24,720 units. The figure for NHS concentrate in hospital is 83,790 units and 52,775 units for home treatment. And then the only commercial concentrate used is armour, 4,995 hospital and 2,295 home treatment. So the use of commercial concentrate rather less in that year, and NHS concentrate, the principal product in use, followed by cryoprecipitate. I don't, I'm afraid, know if we've got the return available for 1982. I don't have a hard copy of it. The figures are 16,800 units of cryo, and then for NHS, 35,540 units of NHS concentrate in hospital, 47,230 units for home treatment. And then, again, it's only the armour product that's used by way of commercial treatment, 17,255 units hospital, 15,790 units for home treatment. So it's NHS concentrate is most in use, followed by commercial concentrate, followed by cryoprecipitate as the treatment still used, but used least of the three. We can display the return for 1983, HCDO 301769. And we can see in 1983, cryoprecipitate still very much in use, although only in hospital, not for home treatment, 58,240 units. The product used most of all is NHS concentrate, 185,746 hospital, 112,785 home. And then the only commercial product used is, again, the Armour product, just over 29,000 hospital, and then a smaller amount, 2,400 home treatment. Thank you. So we don't need to go to it, but the reference for the 1982 annual return was HCDO 301673. So we can see the picture that emerges in 1983 in any event is, first of all, NHS, then cryoprecipitate, then commercial. That is at least consistent with Dr. Ibbotson having said he tried to use British products when available. And then 1984, last of all, HCDO 301863. The product, again, used most of all is the NHS concentrate, 34,700 in hospital, 133,225 for home treatment. And then cryoprecipitate and commercial concentrate used in quite similar measures, 26,810 cryo in hospital, and then factor 8 at 21,610 for home treatment and 5,850 for hospital treatment. So that's the pattern in relation to the Stoke Centre, which does show continued use throughout this period into the 1983-84 of cryoprecipitate, albeit not to the same extent as in earlier periods. Dr. Ibbotson, in his statement, recalled patients being keen on home treatment and that it was supported by the Hemophilia Society. In relation to prophylactic treatment, he says it was left to the decision of haemophiliacs if they wanted to embark on prophylactic treatment. They worked out their usage. His recollection was that patients were informed of the risks of using blood products, and he says patients knew my views on blood products. Although the evidence the inquiries received from patients treated at the centre is not extensive, we do have a statement from a patient diagnosed with Hemophilia B who says that they were not told that there might be a risk of infection from receiving factor 9 product. In relation to knowledge of risk, Dr. Ibbotson attended a number of UK HCDO meetings in the late 70s and early 1980s. If we go to his statement, please, WITN 4678001. And we pick it up at page 7. We can see what he sets out in his statement about his recollection of his knowledge and understanding of risks of infection. Picking it up at paragraph 20, he says, I consider the use of commercial factor 8 at higher risk than UK factor 8 as the history of the donors was limited compared to UK donors, hence my effort always to receive UK material. And then in relation to hepatitis, in the next paragraph he says, I assumed Hep A was not clinically severe. As for hepatitis B is concerned, I had no dealings with it as the patients at North Staffs, as none were positive. Non-A, non-B initially felt to be insignificant, but history proved otherwise. And then...
If you just go back a page, rather than forward a page. Yes, what he says at the very top, above the bottom end of paragraph 18.
Yes. It was apparent to me that all blood and blood products had a hepatitis risk of non-A, and non-B. The greater the number of donors, the greater the risk. Over time, it's becoming apparent that my views were correct and I did not change them. Yes, thank you, sir. So
when he says that they were aware of my views, presumably those were the views he was expressing, were they?
Well, that would be, I think, a fair reading of his statement. What we don't have, I think, is sufficient accounts from those treated at the centre.
No, but his view is that that was his view and he expressed it.
Yes. Well, he talks about his views about preferring British treatment. So whether that's the view, without a further explanation as to why, that he's talking about patients being aware of, I'm not sure is clear from his statement.
Yes, I follow that.
In relation then to the risk of AIDS, in addition to his attendance at UK HCDO meetings, his statement, picking it up at page 8, says this, paragraph 23, initially there was no indication that blood products could cause the transmission of HIV. Over time it became clear that it was a serious developing problem. Unfortunately, it was apparent that stopping the use of blood and blood products could not happen. In answer to question 24, he says, during various meetings, it became apparent that there was an association between blood products and HIV in approximately 1983. And then over the page, his recollection is that patients were switched to heat-treated products as soon as available. And then if we go over to page 10, in answer to question 31, which was about reverting to treatment with cryoprecipitate, he says all patients were offered local treatment with cryoprecipitate. Those on home treatment preferred factor 8, and by the time the full information of HIV was available, supplies of heat-treated factor 8 were on stream. And then he's asked in the next question about the meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors in October 1983, which he was present at. And if we go to the next page, he doesn't recall the discussion. It's unsurprising, perhaps so many years after the event. He says, in response to the question of whether patients raised with him concerns about factor concentrates, he says, they did when it became public knowledge. I agreed there was a risk and let them make their own decision after a discussion. Next paragraph, he says, we had no problems in securing factor 8. And then in answer to the question, were you able to get unlimited amounts of cryoprecipitate? The answer also is yes. And then in relation to the decision recorded in the minutes of that meeting, which was that patients should continue to receive NHS or commercial concentrates, he was asked if he agreed or disagreed with the decision, and he says he agreed with the decision. We don't have, I'm afraid, very much information about the process of testing patients for HTLV3 and informing them of their diagnosis. Dr. Ibbetson's statement says that there was a full discussion prior to screening and post-screening, and that all partners were offered tests when necessary. You do have a statement from a witness who indeed also gave oral evidence to you, who recalled being told about his diagnosis in 1986 by Dr. Ibbetson. It's right to say that's someone who'd been treated in Birmingham and then was being told their diagnosis following transfer to Stoke-on-Trent. And his account was of being called into Dr. Ibbetson's office, the door remaining open, allowing people behind him to hear the conversation, and the doctor saying, "Good morning, I see you are HIV positive." In terms of numbers infected with HIV, the figures that we have from UK HCDO indicate 6 patients. Perhaps if we will go to it, INQY 40250, please. Second page, towards the bottom of the second page, Centre 24, North Staffordshire, Stoke-on-Trent. You'll see there it gives a test result for 1981, which, if correct, could obviously only be a test result on serum stored from 1981, and then moving forward to 1985, a figure for 5, giving a total of 6 cases. However, it's also right to note that Dr. Ibsen, in his statement, let me just find the correct reference, says, I think, that sera was not stored. Yes, in answer to the question in this statement, was work undertaken at the centre to establish the time period during which patients seroconverted? He says no work was undertaken as no serum was retained. So I'm afraid whether that figure of one patient testing positive based on a sample from 1981 is correct or not, I'm afraid we can't answer that.
What would be the position if a patient transferred and their serum was tested from somewhere else?
Yes, well, that's a possibility, yes. Yes, that's certainly a possibility. In relation to hepatitis C, Dr. Ibbetson's recollection was of not having no patients who had clinical non-A non-B hepatitis. He couldn't recall how many patients were infected with hepatitis C. He said as soon as the test became available at the North Staff's lab, patients were informed by him in person of their hepatitis C status. And you have some account from a witness of being informed of hepatitis C diagnosis in 1992 by Dr. Ibbetson. In terms of the treatment arrangements, Dr. Ibbetson's recollection was that patients with HIV were managed locally but offered a referral to Birmingham, and that all hepatitis C patients were referred to the Queen Elizabeth Haemophiliac unit, is how he described it. Although it's also right to note that you have a witness account saying that she received all of her medical treatment at Stoke. So that's the position in relation to Stoke, and probably a good point at which to break before we pick up on the last three centres.
Yes, well, let's come to the last three centres then at 20 to 4.
Thank you.
20 to 4.